Border Crossings has existed for about 18 years now, which means that in England we're entitled to vote. We've finally got some degree of maturity, and it's been a very long and very fascinating learning curve, and one which I hope will continue for a long time. And I started the company really in response to a number of events that occurred when I was a young director in my 20s. I was on what perhaps was a much more conventional kind of career path for, what was a more conventional career path perhaps for a young director from my background. I was doing a lot of Shakespeare and classical work. And I was asked to go to the United States and do a number of productions, one of which was Romeo and Juliet. And this was in the early 90s, so it was just after there had been some very explosive race riots in Los Angeles around the beating of black taxi driver Rodney King by the police. And it felt very tense that the society was on edge. And so it wasn't a very difficult leap for me, who's always been interested in making theatre that feels specific to the place it's happening in and to the audience to which I'm presenting it. It wasn't a very difficult leap to decide that the Capulet should be black and the Montague should be white, and these things are not too hard to come by. But what was really extraordinary was the response, which was, how dare you do this to Shakespeare, which I thought was very interesting. But in America, there is a tendency to think that Shakespeare belongs in wrinkly tights and really has nothing to do with our lives, and that's the way we like it at a distance. But also, there were death threats. It was quite incredible. There was letters from the radical right that said they wanted to murder both me and the young actress who was playing Juliet. And we didn't really believe this until the police tracked down where the letter had come from and discovered the arms cache. So this was actually serious. And I thought about it a bit and thought, well, if the radical right in America want to kill you, it probably means you're doing something right. So this started some ideas sparking, and what was particularly exciting about that production was one of the people who came to see it, who was an Indian playwright called Mahesh Dattani. And Mahesh was fascinated by this production and said that it reminded him very much of conflicts which were also going on in India at the time, it was right in the thick of communal tensions between the Hindu and the Muslim communities, and indeed between the Sikh communities and the Hindus and so on. And he asked me if I would come to India and work in a similar way on Shakespeare's play The Tempest, which of course is a great play about colonialism, amongst other things. Colonialism and magic, spirituality, the great themes of the theatre, and Shakespeare's theatre, after all, was called the Globe. It was a space where he was trying in his own way to bring the world together. And taking Shakespeare's plays to different parts of the world started me thinking about how our theatre nowadays can really begin to address the question of the globe, and how we can start to make work which, in the same way that Shakespeare in his time was reaching out into as broad a mental space as possible and bringing in new discoveries and new ideas, and the shifts which were happening in his own culture, including in language, with new influences coming into English all the time, how we could start to make theatre which, in a similar way, reflected the world that we were living in and the speed of change in that world, because it's something that's become more and more apparent, even since the company was set up actually in the last decade and a half in the UK, is how the insularity of our little island will not work anymore, and how the old sense of binaries and us and them, and there being an other, and of there being foreignness and distinction, is actually something which has become altogether more complex. And we have to recognize the fact and embrace the fact But you walk down the street in London and you hear 400 different languages and you see 4,000 different shades of people, and we are very, very wrapped up in a globalized space. And that space has become, in some ways, even smaller because of the connections of the World Wide Web. And yet at the same time, all of that has started to push people into ever more isolated pockets. And it's one of the things that has fascinated me over the last few years with trying to make this kind of work, has been the way in which a lot of the apparent ease of global communication in fact has the effect of making people pull back from each other, sometimes of making people define themselves very much in opposition to the other, out of fear perhaps, or out of a desire to become in some way superior, and how it can put people into very little, very lonely, very unengaged worlds. And the theatre, of course, is about the opposite of that, which is why it's so important in this era of global electronic communication that we maintain the live in live art. Because what we actually have to have in order really to meet, and in the end theatre is a place of meeting, what we have to have in order to do that is a space where we can meet as equals. And it's very, very difficult to create that space, because we can't do it politically, because there isn't any equality politically. We can't do it economically, because the inequalities in the world are so huge, and militarily, even in areas like healthcare, it's just obscene how big the differences are in the world we live in. But actually, culturally, you can, because culturally, everyone has a voice. And so I think the mission of Border Crossings, as I see it, is what the name of the company says. It's to create an equal playing field where we can come together and we can begin to talk. And that's not always the easiest process in the world. And we've been exploring over the course of the last 18 years the various different ways in which we can begin to make work which in some way moves towards that. And sometimes that has been through doing work which has been, where the script of the piece already exists. And we did a play in 2003, which was by an Australian writer called Thomas Keneally, the man who wrote Schindler's Ark. And this was a play about indigenous Australian culture and its meeting with mainstream, it's an appalling term, white Australian culture. The moment you get into even trying to describe different cultures, it becomes very problematic. And in that play, it was based on something which had actually happened in northern Australia in the 1950s, where a group of Aboriginal people had decided to show to the other tribe, as they perceived the white world, their secret totems, which are called the Ranga, and to bring those out as an offer of something very deep within them. Because what happens between Aboriginal peoples is that when that offer is made, it is reciprocated. And of course the white world had no inner secret, which it could offer in return. And that play was very important to us as an organisation, because for the first time we worked with indigenous people, and since then there have been a series of encounters with cultures of that kind. We run every 2 years a festival which is called the Origins Festival, which is about bringing into London people from, well, so far, the indigenous cultures of Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada. This year, assuming we finally get the money, we'll be working with some Latin American indigenous people as well. Mainly because these viewpoints on the world are so different from the predominant ones in Western culture that their voices become incredibly necessary for our culture to hear, and because they can teach us, well, so many things that we are willfully ignoring to the point of self-destruction. For example, how you live in an environment without destroying the environment. How you plant your footprint on the earth without destroying the earth. How you deal with people who are older than yourself and people who are younger than yourself. In indigenous cultures, elders are regarded as fountains of knowledge. in the culture which I come from, we put them in homes and wait for them to die. In indigenous cultures, younger people are regarded as the source of the new energy which can come into your society, and in our culture they are regarded as delinquent, and frequently that energy becomes misplaced and channeled into violence and crime, and we simply condemn that and stamp upon it without thinking why it is that the society's made it that way. And perhaps most importantly of all, actually, in that list, indigenous cultures also have a great deal to tell us about democracy. And this relates to what I was saying before about the need to create equal spaces for cultural dialogue. Because our democracy in the last few years has become unbelievably and utterly debased because it has been sold. I was talking to someone who worked in one of the British embassies. It was the British Embassy in the United States a little while ago. And he was very honest. He said his job as a diplomat has become to broker trade and to make facilities open for British companies to do business in the United States. And I think you can see very clearly how foreign policy from countries like the United States, like Great Britain, like most of the countries in the European Union, has become ever more about trying to get their countries to make more money somewhere, and particularly in this region, to the point where it's becoming, well, it's incredibly dangerous. And there are decisions being made by our foreign offices which are entirely about facilitating the increase of wealth in certain very, very big international issues. Should be about. Democracy is about the voice of the people and the sovereignty of the people, and the equality of the people. Hello. Come in. Please come. There's loads of people waiting outside. Oh. You're very welcome. There's another bench in front. Come, sit on the front bench. Sits on the front bench, he says, talking about British democracy. Okay, we'll go somewhere. And so, one of my interests in bringing in the indigenous cultures into London is what they have to say about real democracy, which is an equal democracy. Because the oldest democracies in the world, in spite of the fact that London's parliament calls itself the mother of parliaments, it isn't. And neither actually was the oldest democracy in the world in Athens. The oldest democracies in the world exist in the tribal councils of North America. These go back 40, 50,000 years. And the way in which they operate is one of absolute equality, where everybody has a voice, to the point where someone is even nominated to speak for the animals and for the land around, because that also requires a voice in the council. And if they cannot have their own within the language, then someone else needs to speak for them. And really interestingly, this model has now been adopted into one official government in the world, which is the government of Nunavut. Nunavut, which is the Inuit territory in the north of Canada, where there are only 12 members on the legislatory panel, and between them they all elect, they are elected by the people of Nunavut, and then those 12 people elect who will be the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister chooses who the 2 or 3 ministers will be, and then everyone else quizzes them all the time. So it's a completely open, participatory process, and that is what we have to find our way back to. And our theatre, in a very, very small way, is an experiment with attempting to do that. But of course, because we don't believe in making our lives easy, we don't just do it within our own country, and we don't even do it in the festival. We also do it very much in relation to working globally, because actually now that is the bigger question. Because the nation state, if you ask me, has had its day. I think what's going to happen in the next 50 years or so is we're going to see increasingly things happening on a very, very local level, which is one place where theatre is incredibly valuable, of course, because it can spring out of the immediacy of a particular situation on the ground. And I think we're going to see things happening increasingly on the global scale, because because that's where the huge decisions are being made and actually need to be made in order to save the planet from both environmental and, however we want to call this, cross-cultural breakdown. And so the spaces for dialogue on the local level and the global level are what we have to find a way towards. And sometimes the two can be similar, which is why I'm very interested in making pieces in collaboration with companies like Zoukak from other countries, where we can perform it in both spaces and thereby find ourselves not just addressing one particular local audience, but thinking in terms both of the local audience we will address and also how that will ramify much more widely on a global scale. So as I said, sometimes we have worked with texts that exist, but ever more we are now trying to create new work, because new work needs to be made to address an ever-changing world. And sometimes that has been with asking a writer to create a new play. And this is how I first got to know, well actually I first got to know Brian before that, but the first work that Brian did with the company was a new play which he wrote in a more conventional way than this one, which is a piece called Double Tongue, which in many ways was a response to the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. And in many ways it was a very successful play, one of the most successful we've done. We've also made a series of pieces in the last few years with companies from Asia, principally from India and from China. And these, well, if you ignore China, you've lost the 21st century, really, haven't you? It's very, very much the Chinese century, and of course China is an essential partner in any kind of cross-cultural discussion, and is also probably the most difficult one, precisely because it's this vast, very, very powerful space which has been closed off for a very, very long time. Not just under Mao Zedong and so on, but actually for about 500 years before that, deliberately shut itself off from the rest of the world, and therefore has a very inward-looking, a very dynamic culture. And now that culture and that economy is reaching out into the world and is affecting all of us, and so we really, really have to find ways of understanding each other. And so we've worked over the last few years on a series of co-productions, mainly with the Shanghai Dramatic Arts Centre, where we've been trying to make work which is able to address both our audiences in Britain and their audiences in China. It's very, very hard to do because there's very little common language. And so a lot of the time we've been working through improvisation and through ways of performing which don't include much language. And strangely, I'm going to show you something in a minute which includes lots of English, but believe me, a lot of it doesn't include language. Or where it does, it mixes languages up. I'm very interested in language, not only as something which communicates directly, but also as something which can be used to obscure, which can be difficult, which can be ambiguous, and also in language as music. Because I think one of the things that's most vital in the kind of political discourse I've been talking about is that we make the space for emotion. And I think the thing that has debased our politics more than anything else is its lack of humanity, its lack of human depth. It always amazes people these days when you remind them that in Aristotle's Politics, the founding book of Western democracy, Book 6 is a book about music. And that actually, at the heart of any process, there needs to be the space of contemplation, the space into which we can go and think and just clear a little bit of time in order to formulate possibilities and to begin the negotiations. So I've been asked if I'll show you a couple of little bits of work. I'm going to show you something from a play called Consumed, which we made very recently with Shanghai Dramatic Arts Centre. And it's, of course, unbelievably complicated and very difficult to explain, but I'll do my best. Consumed, the title, was came because we wanted to talk about consumerism on some level, but we also wanted to talk about obsessions and the way in which people can become very driven and obsessed. I think in many ways it was actually a response to the global financial crisis, and there have been quite a lot of plays in Britain about the financial crisis, but I don't think any of them have really dealt with the fact that it is global. And so we wanted to make a play about people who were in a world we didn't understand very much, which was banking. People who, well, it's something I learned from doing opera, from Mozart. In Mozart's operas, he takes the people he thinks he doesn't like and he gives them the best music. And I think that's a very important thing to learn about theatre, is that it becomes most exciting when you're able to find the humanity in the person who you thought was your enemy. Because that's when it starts to open the possibility of real exchange. And so we wanted to make a piece about bankers, and we also wanted to make a piece which was about global connections and technological connections. And so we made it through a workshop which was much longer than the one we've had here. It was a month or so in China with 3 actors, myself and a video technician. So we took into the room lots of little cameras and computers, and we did scenes on Skype, we did scenes with people in completely different rooms from each other. And it became, very interestingly, because we were making a play which was in many ways about communication, it became a play about loneliness.